Ladies and gentlemen, it is Q&A time. So we will follow a certain protocol. That is, I will share the questions with the individual speakers, and the speakers will respond. The first question is directed against our Air Marshal Chowdhury, who is the Commandant of the National Defence College. The question is, how do we transform, how do we adopt our militaries to the non-state actor threat more effectively? So in Afghanistan, there were 350,000 troops trained for 20 years by the American military. 20 years more advanced than most other militaries, by the European military. But even after 20 years of investment, so much of training, equipment, resources, they were unable to stand the brunt of the Taliban. 70 to 80,000 fighters, insurgents, terrorists. So what more can be done to develop those capabilities to fight non-state groups motivated by ideologies such as the Taliban from occupying, from making inroads that have very serious implications for the security and stability of the region and the world?
Thank you. I think for a extremely relevant and I would say a question, I think, which is staring us in the face. And here I would like to take you all to the fact that we have always looked at the utilization of force in a very conventional, certain manner over the past years. Overwhelming force, the whole approach of the use of force towards national interests of a nation. But when you have and that worked fine when you have a conventional threat, because then it's very clear. I mean, then there are past precedences, past ways of thinking have a lot of relevance. But the challenge is, how do you deal with an enemy who doesn't think like you? So here, what I want to make a point is that today we have to restructure our idea and the concepts of the use of force in an entirely different manner. A force usage has to be more adaptable, more agile, more flexible, flatter, less hierarchical, so that response times are least and tailored to the threat. And I mentioned this earlier, that this approach of one size fits all, and this is typically the approach which most militaries take, because militaries tend to be hierarchical organizations and they're sort of mammoth structures which are extremely resilient to change. So it takes time. And here, what is important, I think, is that most militaries, in fact, have remained the same way. But when you are faced with threats, like I said, which I mentioned earlier, they're no longer at your borders, they're at your very doorsteps. It needs us to understand that security is no longer the preserve of the military alone today, not anymore. There are a whole lot of other players, other participants, other stakeholders who have a very vital role to fit in. So now the challenge is finding a common ground, but it has to be obviously threat specific. Again, you can't have one set of rules or war fighting norms or threat mitigation approaches, which we would like typically, which happens in conventional militaries, that we work out a set of solutions or an approach or a certain set of tactics, and we train on that. But how do you train where the tactics are constantly changing? So herein comes the challenge between tactics and training. So my point which I was trying to make is that fundamentally that we have to really rethink as to how do conventional militaries become much more flexible, much more swift, much more agile, light on their feet, and you will have to bring in other elements of the government, other aspects of all comprehensive state power to come together. It needs security domain specialists, domain specialists, all to come together and play a role towards this. And I think that is something which is the future, but it will obviously face the challenge of the resilience which conventional militaries tend to face when faced with a change of doing things in a traditional manner. But this is something which is, now that it has come in phase, we find countries in most nations are trying to adapt. And this is something I would only say is work in progress, because as a whole topic of this conference is new normal. I would like to add it. I think there are so many shifting goalposts that is almost adapting to new normals, and a lot of them are running in parallel. So it's a bit of a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Asma Khwaja, the next question is for you. Do you believe that with the rise of Taliban, that there will be more extremism and exclusivism in Pakistan and in the region? If you look at the history of Taliban from 1996 to 2001, Taliban hosted Al-Qaeda that ran 30 to 40 different terrorist training camps. Taliban destroyed the most beautiful Buddhas, the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Taliban mistreated the women, conducted amputations, beheadings, and stonings. Do you think the new Taliban has significantly changed? Or do you think that the impact of the return of the Taliban will have cascading effects on Pakistan and the region?
Thank you for asking this pertinent question. Like all other countries in the world, Pakistan is also observing and seeing that how Taliban would rule Afghanistan this time. I would like to mention here that Taliban's are in the government, or like they have captured Kabul because the US and Western alliance signed a peaceful agreement with them and returned from Afghanistan without fulfilling the goals or objectives they promised 20 years back. So right now, like all other regional countries, we are witnessing this transition, and we are hoping for the best, because any instability or any further turmoil in Afghanistan would be directly going to affect Pakistan's security and peace and security situation. But here, as a student of peace and conflict studies and strategic studies, I would like to mention that it is very important that we should not judge a party to a conflict, because we are not judges, we are not referees. Afghans know, I think, the interference and interpretations of international community couldn't bring anything good for Afghans and Afghanistan for last 40 years. So maybe this is the time that the international community should be enough supportive or facilitators role, but should not directly intervene or become a judge in Afghanistan for Afghans. And we, as far as we have seen till today, that Taliban's are trying to make themselves acceptable for the civilized world. They are trying not to repeat their mistakes which they have committed in their earlier regime. But still, we have to see and wait that if they can, their actions would follow the words they have used. So this is my precise answer, and definitely, the instability in Afghanistan, turmoil in Afghanistan, a civil war in Afghanistan would have severe security effects for Pakistan, and Pakistan cannot afford it as well. So, as far as the issue of rise of extremism is concerned, I am a bit apprehensive about it, because Pakistan is one of those few countries, as we were talking about non-state actors. Pakistan is one of those few countries with Pakistan laid 70,000 lives in the war against terrorism on Pakistani soil, and we are one of those few countries who won that war, and we successfully dismantled, seized, finished, eliminated, mitigated those terrorist elements on our soil. And this was a difficult war because regular army is not been trained to fight against ghosts. And all those non-state actors, violent non-state actors, they are like ghosts because you never know, because they don't fight from the front. So it was a new norm. It was a new type of warfare Pakistan was indulged in post 9/11. So Pakistan also has a very Pakistan has also learned its lessons. So I believe that Taliban, we hope we can only see, but definitely I don't think it will lead to the extremism because the other networking or the context or the environment which a country needs in which the extremism can flourish, especially the violent extremism, that is dismantled in Pakistan. So let's see, but it will definitely affect our dreams of our economic prosperity, development, and peace overall.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Professor Khan to respond to the next question. Please give a very short response because we are running against time. You spoke about social media radicalization. Could you share with us from a Bangladeshi perspective whether the return of the Taliban, whether the return of Al-Qaeda, because more than 40 Al-Qaeda groups have congratulated, welcomed, celebrated, and even taken the oath of allegiance to Taliban since the 15th of August. Do you think that is going to have an impact on your population? Do you think that a very tiny segment of people in Bangladesh will be politicized and radicalized and mobilized, and whether there will be a surge of extremism and terrorism in your country? And we would like you to respond to this question looking back at JMB, looking at the attack that you suffered in the Holy Artisan Cafe. So from that perspective, can you respond to this threat? Question?
Thank you, Professor. I think this is probably a very minuscule population we're talking about because over the past 5 years, our success has been replicated in many of the countries. Social resilience has become a major source of a strength for Bangladesh. The law enforcement agencies have become quite active. But of course, transnational nature of extremism and online still remains a problem, like many other countries. And this transnational phenomena is obviously some sort of concern for Bangladesh, like any other countries. And particularly after the Taliban resurgence, there are some pockets, but I personally believe, and speaking to many of the law enforcement agencies, we are still not significantly concerned or worried about this particular group of people that you have mentioned. But certainly the counterterrorism unit has beefed up their monitoring. But what we would probably be looking forward over the next few months of time is beef up some sort of monitoring of certain groups across the region and look into how they will be behaving. So the online monitoring is probably the priority at the moment. The second important factor is that we have a considerable strong intelligence cooperation with many of our friendly neighbors, as well as the international community that helps us in creating a lot of deterrence. The economic situation of the country has improved considerably over the period of time, which has caused a strong resilience against terrorism. But obviously, there are some lone wolves issues still prevailing, but that does not signify a significant threat to the polity. And I would certainly mention that the political regimes are quite committed to ensure that no safe haven for whatsoever entities wants to use Bangladesh territory will be deterred. So far, there is no need to be concerned about these entities, academically speaking, politically, or perhaps socially speaking. There is anything to be concerned about at the moment. Thank you, Professor.
I think you should be very concerned. Please don't take threats for granted, because I think
No,
it's
of course,
to
of course,
protect your
of course.
country, national security is important. So do not dismiss it.
We do.
You're a
We do.
respected
There's
academic.
we don't have any comprehensive, of course. We have the strictest possible monitoring. But when I say we don't have the concern, does not mean we take it for like lightly. No. As I mentioned, that the transnational phenomena is an issue, and obviously online is a gray area. But that doesn't mean that we will give anything for free ride. No, that doesn't happen. So the monitoring is very much there. And as I mentioned, the political commitment as well as the social resilience. As I mentioned, that many other countries, even if you take Oslo, Auckland, even having the perfect possible watertight system of security still happened. So it happens everywhere. But as I also even mentioned in my statement, that even Washington suffered from massive affliction. So it happens.
Okay.
So in terms of the best possible security regime, yes, we have. In terms of best possible monitoring, yes, we have. But again, as I mentioned, transnational connectivity, transnational or online radicalization is always a problem like any other country. So we take it very seriously, and the alert and the monitoring is very much there.
Thank you.
We don't allow free riding at all. Professor, thank you very much for your concern, and
Thank
we are
you.
very concerned.
You
Sure.
may recall,
but we don't take it like,
you may recall in Sri Lanka we had 10 years of perfect peace
Absolutely.
when we ended the LTT terrorist campaign, but we suffered one devastating terrorist attack because the then government neglected national security. So I want to tell you that there's no economic prosperity and there's no social harmony without national security at its base. So this is a key lesson from our nation, and we would like to share that with your beautiful country.
Absolutely.
Ladies and
Professor.
gentlemen, let me ask the final question from Professor Roger Kangas. Professor, if you are the American president, if you were the American president in the month of July and August, how would you have enabled the transition of US and Western forces out of Afghanistan? You armed, trained, financed, directed 350,000 Afghan troops over 20 years to stabilize that nation. But the final phase of that operation was chaotic. You couldn't even hold an election to ensure that there was inclusive participation and a stable government came to power in Afghanistan. So think that you are in the White House and respond to this question. Thank you very much.
Excellent question. Let's see, I'd probably cancel any vacation during that time because it clearly would take a lot of work and effort. One or two quick comments to preface my remark. First, we're obviously not privy to the conversations that went on in the White House, National Security Council, the Defense Department, State Department, and all that. So we're conjecturing, what they did or did not do. This is part of the discussion in the U.S. Were they ill prepared? Did they not pay attention, etc.? The second element, of course, is the Afghan focus. What was going on inside the Ghani administration? What was going on with the various regional leaders, particularly as they began to strike independent deals with the Taliban, through the months of July and August? It will take a good historian or good analyst years from now to look back at this period and I think do a proper job of parsing it out. I'm going to highlight actually one of my colleagues, Ali Jalali, who wrote a piece 5 years ago. It was in 2016. He wrote a piece assessing the training of the Afghan military, these 300 plus thousand troops. And in it, he raised several concerns. He said that, if the capacity to support these troops isn't consistent, you're going to have a fall off in capabilities. If retention of officers and senior enlisted isn't consistent, you're going to have an uneven set of capabilities in the organization. And lastly, if the administration in Kabul isn't viewed as a legitimate regime, soldiers, and this is regardless of which military, don't tend to fight well for governments they don't support. And as I said, he wrote this 5 years ago, and he kind of laid out, here are policy recommendations for the Afghan government and for the US of how we could ensure that this doesn't happen. Well, it did happen. And so clearly, certain measures weren't taken. Both in Kabul, I think there was a sense the US was never going to leave the West, that there were renegotiations with NATO, continuation of forces. And I don't think people took seriously the statements that we were departing. And I should say, for some good reason, Barack Obama first announced our departure in 2011, and my goodness, almost 10 years later we left. That's a bad guest in most household parties. Donald Trump signs this so-called peace deal with the Taliban in 19, which really was just about measuring U.S. departure, not as much about conditions on the ground. But there were certain protocols in there that were putting some conditions on the Taliban, which, by the way, have never been met. So we have all these conditions at play. And now, finally, to your point, what I would have done perhaps is, at least it appears, they did plan for what would probably be the best case scenario. People felt that the government was going to stay in for a bit. Even Ghani was assuring in early August that, all was fine. Perhaps they didn't plan, or should I say, take seriously the worst. Recall in the fall of 2001, the Taliban fell very, very quickly. The international forces and the Northern Alliance believed that they would probably hold on for a year or two. They fell within 2 months. You fast forward to 2021, the Ghani government and the regime that was in place fell within days, not the weeks, months, or even a year that was anticipated that they could develop a transition government. So, I just look at it, I'm, trying to be dispassionate about this and see mistakes were made. Now, in terms of the tactical issues, we'll know more as this comes out, airport management. Why wasn't Bagram used as opposed to Karzai Airport? All sorts of questions I think are valid. Sharing airport security with the Taliban, who was incapable, as it turned out, of thwarting the Islamic State Khorasan attack. All of these decisions, we simply don't know the details of those. We'll have to wait. But I would say, there probably wasn't as much planning for the worst. Maybe we thought, or the leadership in Washington thought, that the situation would likely turn out better. Maybe I'm more of a pessimist, and so I would have thought differently. A long answer, but there are so many different threads to pull out on this one that I thought it important to raise that. Back to you, sir.
This can be the topic of your next book. Now, governments must always plan for best case scenario and worst case scenario. And I think this is a classic example where the world's largest and the most capable military did not prepare for that eventuality. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to conclude this session. I'm not going to pose a question to Admiral Octavian because I think he made such a comprehensive presentation. And I want to conclude this session by referring to Admiral Octavian's presentation. He highlighted a very important aspect. He said that the apex threat facing the world today is from the pandemic. And he implied that without investing so much of resources in destroyers, in frigates, in aircraft carriers, right, space-based weapons, we have to address the reality of today. People are dying of COVID, of the pandemic. And we have to strengthen the health sector. The military has to support the health sector. The law enforcement has to support the health sector. The intelligence community has to work very closely with the defense in developing the capabilities to monitor the threats emanating from the biological agents. So I believe that today's session, hosted by KDU, is a vital session. It's an eye-opener for the law enforcement, military, and the intelligence community of the world. That is, as the world is engulfed with a pandemic, how do we transform our budgets? How do we transform our thinking? How do we get our military officers to think differently, to meet these grave challenges, sustained challenges that is facing us? That includes transnational crime, includes terrorism and extremism, but mostly it includes the surging pandemic. Thank you very much. And in concluding this session, let me once again pay a tribute to the Vice Chancellor of KDU, General Milinda Peris, for his leadership. You organized a flawless event this time too, despite the pandemic. The inauguration was exceptionally well received, and I think that the session we concluded has been a very active session, and I hope that you will all continue the debate and the discussion on these crucial points. I wish all the speakers and the audience good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was a very interesting and lively discussion, and I believe we will all leave this session with much food for thought. I would like to once again thank the chairperson, Professor Rohan Gunaratne, for gracing the 14th International Research Conference with his presence, despite his busy schedule. I would also like to thank the distinguished speakers of the first plenary for Defense and Strategic Studies, Professor Roger Kangas, Mr. Nitin A. Gokal, Dr. Azma Shakir Khwaja, Professor Shah Benem Khan, Air Marshal D. Chaudhry, AVSM, VM, VSM, and Vice Admiral Professor IR Amarul Octavian, ST, MSc, DESD, for sharing their thoughts on the theme Security, Stability, and National Development in the New Normal. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to humbly invite Major General M.P. Peris, the Vice Chancellor of General Sir John Kotalawala Defence University, to present a token of appreciation to the chairperson of the session, Professor Rohan Gunaratne. Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we conclude the first plenary for Defense and Strategic Studies for the 14th International Research Conference. We will commence the second plenary for Defense and Strategic Studies at 1:45 p.m. Therefore, I request that you be online via the same link for the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, may we ask that you may proceed for refreshments served in the lobby area. Thank you.